Hi, within this lecture, we're going to learn something called arbitrary arguments and keyword arguments. Okay, so let me mark this down for you and you see how it's written and how it's pronounced, and then I will explain what they are. So first, we will learn arbitrary arguments and then keyword arguments. Okay, these arguments actually let us work with more than one arguments, and we actually did that in the previous lecture, right? So we did a summation with 3 numbers, but what if I wanted to do it with 5 numbers or 6 numbers or whatever user chooses to do? So it is easy to do it with 2 numbers. So let me create a summation 2 function in here, in which we will have num1 and num2 as input, and all I want to return is number 1 plus number 2. Okay, this is easy. So what happens if our user wants to add in a third input? Then I add number 3. But what happens if user changes his mind or her mind and actually wants to sum 2 numbers? Then we are going to use these arguments, arbitrary arguments. Okay, so how do we do that? We will use the sum built-in function of Python first in order to have a meaningful structure here. Remember, before we have messed with the sum and then change it back to sum m, right? So there is a sum built-in function. So let me just show you how it's done. So we say star args here, and then we say sum args. So we're going to sum up these arguments that our user has given to us. So let me try this with 10, 20, 30, and I get an error, okay, and it says that this has to have in a positional argument of number 2, and I think this is why we shouldn't mess up with the built-in functions of Python. So it kind of broke the original function when we first defined this sum function up there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over here to cell or kernel first. I'm going to interrupt this. I'm going to restart everything from the beginning, and I'm going to rerun these cells and rerun the cell all below. Okay, so I didn't mess up with the sum function right now, so it should work properly. So this is defined as sum m, so my sum function is how it's originally built right now. So as you can see, now this works. So let me try this one more time with much more arguments, 50, 60, 70, 80, and it sums up all of them. So it doesn't matter right now how many arguments user gives. Okay, let me show you what's going on behind by creating a star arguments function. All it has to do is just printing the arguments. So if I say my func and 1020, it will just print out the arguments. Okay, it just takes the arguments and does whatever we want to do with it. So let me try this. AB12, it just takes it and prints them out. So this arguments thing lets us work with multiple arbitrary arguments. So do we have to call these star args? Not actually, but for convention we generally call it args. Okay, but if we don't, it will still work. So let me create a new func2. Okay, my func2 is star until this time rather than args. So if I print until right now, it will still work. So let me try this. My func2 a b ATIL and 1, 2, 3, for example. As you can see, it still prints out the arbitrary arguments. But I really don't suggest you to change the args keyword here because this is Python convention and other programmers might not understand what you're doing at this point. This is just to show you that it works both ways. So I'm going to just make this into a command line here by adding hash and rerunning these cells. Another subject that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture was the keyword arguments, and they let us to create keyword pairings with values like in dictionaries when we get an input from the user actually this time. So best way to explain this through an example again. So let me create a function with keyword arguments this time. So this will be an example function and I'm going to put 2 stars right now and say keyword arguments, okay, key w args. And again, this time these 2 stars actually matter and key vargs doesn't matter. So I could have just name it Attila or anything I want. So let me print out these keyword arguments and let me show you how this actually works. So let's call our example function. Now I have to give some keyword and key and value pairings actually. So I'm going to go with the same example that we were doing in the previous lectures, like running is 100 calories and swimming or basketball is 200 calories. Remember the example, right? Swim is 200 and basketball is 300 calories. Okay, if I hit shift enter, as you can see, it printed out the keyword arguments for us. So it just takes in input as a key and value pairings and do whatever we want with it. So if I say example function and a is 1, b is 2, it will just print out this key value pairings. But how do we use it in real life examples? So maybe we want to check something is in the keys or values. We can do that, right? With a function. Of course we can. What do we have to do is just create a new function with keyword arguments and then have an if statement within this function with the function indentation and check whatever we want. At this point, actually, we don't know how many arguments, how many key and value pairings our user going to give, but we know we can control one of them, right? So let's call this keyword example or keyword function for instance. Okay, so keyword function, and it will have an input of keywords, and then I will check if the Metallica is inside one of the keys. How do I do that? I use an if statement, of course. All I want to say just if Metallica, and with a quotation, of course, because this is a string, if Metallica in keyword arguments, right? You remember in, so if Metallica in keywords, then it means that the user has given Metallica as input or key. So print heavy metal, for instance. And else if Metallica is not in here, then all I want to do is just print out a rock is that, for instance. Okay, so I'm checking whether the Metallica is in the keywords, and if it is, I'm going to print out heavy metal, and if it's not, I'm going to say rock is that. So let's try this keyword function, and let's start with Metallica, and Metallica will be 10, Madonna will be 20 or 5, I don't know. Let's say Muse is actually 4. So it says heavy metal, so it works. If I didn't include the Metallica in here, let's do the Madonna again. It won't say heavy metal, but rather it will say rock is that. So let's say Mickey, and we get the rock is that. So we now know how to work with arguments and keyword arguments. Now we will stop here, and within the next lecture we're going to cover some practical usage of functions.